All right. Well, thank you so much. It's a true honor to be here today among all of you. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is, what can we do with all the data that surrounds us? And before I kind of begin the talk, I want to kind of say a few words about, I spent my early career surrounded by historians. So I grew to appreciate really how differently, how much we think that today is new. We've heard, from some of the earlier conversation about, sort of this chaos of the communicative landscape and, how different things are today. But it's important to kind of rewind the clock and realize that, there's always been change. There has always been, especially technological and communicative change. And we've always sort of viewed this world through that lens of chaos. You think about, for example, when the radio and television came out, the profound change. Many of us forget, when satellite, when the first satellite television reached Russia, there was actually this discussion of is this actually an act of war? This messaging that we don't want is being forcefully placed on our country, and that actually was, satellite in particular was a truly profound change, because before countries did have that ability to control. You did have the ability to control to a large degree the messaging in your country, but suddenly you've lost that degree. Other people can message to your citizens. We think about the profound shift, the rise of imagery in communication, the rise of television and photography. I mean, many of us forget that the way we used to see, rewind the clock 200 years or even 150 years, through towards the end of the 1800s, books tended not to have illustrations. I mean, books themselves were oftentimes rare, but we really experienced the world through words. This notion of seeing the world around us, especially seeing it in color, was so different. And so kind of opening with that notion of, as much as today we may, sort of see, my God, what's happening to this world, we've always had that. And also I think one of the things that I've heard the Russian ads, of course, were raised today. Those that come from the espionage world, those that come from the propaganda world, we understand that, this is simply classic propaganda work. While, CNN and Washpost and all these papers are running these breathless headlines, my God, can you imagine what's happened here? Facebook has destroyed, the very fabric of democracy. This has always happened. And, if you go back and read any history of intelligence, you'll see how much the United States has done this abroad and how active we've been, to the point of kinetic action, of actually physically taking action. And it's also very important to understand when we talk about information, to talk about the difference between production, consumption, and impact. And in today's world, we tend to conflate those three. We talk about Facebook lights, and we say, well, look, 1 million people saw my message. Washpost had the headline, was it nearly 1 billion people may have seen the Facebook ads run by the Russians potentially. But what does that mean? We forget, it was just 70 years ago, less than 70 years ago, that the quote-unquote silver bullet theory was still in vogue. This idea that all someone had to do, so for those of you that aren't familiar, the silver bullet theory was this idea of propaganda research, and was very popular, believe it or not, in the communicative landscape. This idea that all we had to do was see a message, and it would magically infect us with believing that message. So this was a big part of World War II propaganda research, this idea that the Nazis were putting out all this messaging, and all we had to do was consume that messaging, and suddenly it would turn us all into Nazis. And so this is what drove so much of that work and that research and trying to understand what were they messaging to Americans, what were they messaging abroad. In fact, this actually led to what's known as open source intelligence, the formalization both within the US and our allies and now most governments around the world of monitoring open sources, things like media, to try and understand what are the perspectives. An ordinary person sitting in Russia, at their breakfast table, what are they seeing about the world? How is the world being portrayed to them? And how might that specific lens that they see differ from their neighbor, differ from somewhere else across the world? And it's very important to understand that production, which is historically what most people measure, is they look at, well, how much material is being put out there. That's very different than consumption. Those of us that study, say, North Korean media, understand that yes, there's a lot of messaging there, supporting their leader, but that doesn't necessarily mean that because I see X number of messages means that many people believe that their leader is this incredible person. Consumption, simply because I see a message. If I'm a staunch Republican and I see a message that's a very liberal message, or if I'm staunch liberal and I see a very conservative message, that doesn't mean that I'm instantly going to change my viewpoint. Certainly if you're in the middle, perhaps that might be, and there's been a lot of interesting work there, but it doesn't mean on those polarized sides, simply exposure, consumption has very little, it doesn't mean nearly as much. But also impact. So today we have this messaging, especially viral campaigns have become very popular today. But there's been a growing body of work that actually asks, of course, we have these nice, meme terms, slacktivism and so on and so forth. But there actually is a lot of conversation, growing body of conversation about, so we have something that's called compassion fatigue or media fatigue, depending on what field you're in, that talks about when we hear about something. So you take, for example, Puerto Rico. You see this big spike in coverage and it dies off. And it turns out mathematically you have about 72 hours of burst coverage for any natural disaster. And this actually holds across the world's media systems, across languages, across print and broadcast, and online. You have about 72 hours and you have about 14 days before the story completely vanishes. And it turns out, and this is something that those of you that are journalists or have studied journalism understand, media fatigue, compassion fatigue. But one of the kind of interesting, complicating factors that we're seeing today is this idea that in the past, if you felt strongly about something, you took action. You called up your congressperson, you marched in the streets, you did something. Today, as the Chinese and the Russians learned a long time ago, if you want to stop people from acting on their concerns, provide them an outlet. If you allow this tension to build and build and build like a balloon, eventually it bursts and people do things. But if you make them feel either that they can take action through words alone, you allow them, so with words alone, you think about all these viral campaigns. We have every day a new viral campaign spreads, and we say, look, 10 million people all wrote about their experiences in X on Facebook. Look, we did it. We solved all the world's problems. This is great. But the problem is that, rewind the clock, 50 years ago, a campaign like that, people was taking to the streets. They were actually forcing action. And especially political elites, we oftentimes forget that, yes, if they see some metric that says 50 million people tweeted about something, that doesn't really mean the same to them as there are 10,000 people marching in the street and holding vigil outside of their own office. We kind of forget about the power of physical mobilization, of action. And there is this growing question of all of this media, all this ability for us to communicate electronically. It both profoundly allows us to connect, but again, connect with those like us. You think about the very notion of Facebook itself. Facebook really didn't start as a platform for the world to talk to each other. It started as a platform to talk with your friends and neighbors, to really, again, connect you with people like you. So we think about this world of data. But also this failure, again, to look beyond our own borders, whether those are national borders, disciplinary borders for the academics in the room, or social cultural borders. We hear in this country about, well, e-government's impossible. We can't modernize government. And then you have the example of Estonia, where I have national heritage from. A completely digital society. We heard, about waiting at the DMV and the long lines there. In Estonia, when it comes time to renew your license, just click a button. Filing your taxes takes 5 minutes. You think about the possibilities. Now, of course, then you hear this argument, well, you can't scale. It's 1 million people there. You can't scale this to something the size of the US. And we have India's biometric card rolled out to I believe the latest government number is 1.2 billion people. It's very possible. These things are very possible, but they require the political will to think creatively. When I landed in Washington, D.C., so when I landed in Washington, I thought, new administration, I thought, my God, everyone's going to, there's digital. I'm hearing people talking my language, using technology to solve government. When I landed out there and interviewed actually for the White House Fellows Program, and the actual quote was, extraordinarily overqualified for government service. And I said, how can this possibly be? Got the same response, went over to USDS and a lot of the other groups that were really focused on technology innovation. And really the response came back, it was much like Silicon Valley. We want people we can drop into a little box. So at the time period, Veterans Affairs was interesting. We want people we can drop into a little box that specialize, say, in writing mobile apps to a certain protocol in a certain space. So kind of higher ups have still kind of already decided what we want to do. And we're going to kind of drop people in little boxes versus that bottom up of listening to society. What does society want? And we think about things like self-censorship. That's not a concept we've really had to think about in this country, certainly in recent memories. It's not something that has been in the forefront of discussion. So people say, well, my God, how did Donald Trump win? The poll numbers were completely absent. How did Brexit occur? The poll numbers certainly weren't showing that. But it turns out online polls, reputable online polls that were run soundly, actually showed all of this. And what we're finding is that, you take something like Brexit. At the time period, it was not necessarily good for one's future career to walk around saying, I support Brexit. So people learn to self-censor. And those of us that focus globally, whose work is mostly focused globally, these are issues we focus on every day. In North Korea, you're not going to be able to walk around, run into someone and say, what do you think of dear leader? Well, amazingly, 110% of the people love him. And you think about, in this particular country, you think about like a phone poll. I get a random call at the middle of the day from some unknown number saying, hey, I wanted to ask you about really, really contentious social issues. And I know your name, I know where you live, I know all your details. And I promise you that I won't put your name attached to this, but who knows what might happen. How many of us are really going to be willing to talk about, our really how we feel about the world? And so all these things really come together in this notion of, there's kind of this idea of technology as savior, that all we need is technology, and technology will solve all of the world's ills. But technology is merely a tool. It's part of a larger societal process. And this notion that, society always adapts. My PhD was in information science, and we talk a lot about how people use information, how they use technology and the tools available to them. And society always adapts. Anytime you build a tool, it's always going to be used in ways you couldn't dream of before. And this is why it's been very frustrating to many of us to see things like Facebook and Twitter kind of proceed along this dimension of we don't need to know what's been done before. We don't need to know how people have communicated before. We don't need to know how different platforms and different tools have tried to guide usage of their platforms. Technology will save all. So that's why you have things like the Facebook's ad campaign. There was a meeting 4 years ago where there was a lot of discussion with members of Facebook from a broader human rights community saying, look, this is how people shut down activists. Here's how governments try to influence elections. And there was kind of this notion, well, that's not really interesting to us. We don't need to bring in experts that specialize in these areas. And of course, people, technology and society adapts. And it was very profound to hear, one of Twitter's co-founders, gave an interview not that long ago where he said, we thought that all we had to do was give the world information and magically everything would be wonderful. And, kind of that profound misunderstanding of how society uses data. And so part of what I'm going to talk about today is what are some of the good ways that we can use data? What are some of the ways, especially this notion of trying to generate profound empathy? In particular, how do we draw people's attention to the things that are happening around the world? You think about Puerto Rico. For a while it was in the news, and now it's not in the news as much. It's still, a little bit there, but we're not bombarded with it moment by moment by moment by moment. So it's very easy for those of us that don't have family there. It becomes kind of easy to say, oh yeah, I remember there's some stuff happening over there. Take the Rohingya in Burma. This notion of how do we really help ourselves see the world around us? And I really like this quote, this notion if we're trying to talk about crises and using data for good, any fool can tell a crisis when it arrives. The real service to society is detected in embryo. And when I read these words from Isaac Asimov's Foundation series as a child, it really fascinated me. This notion that we could use, so he introduces this concept of psychohistory. This science fiction idea of using massive amounts of data to understand society and understand where are we going at very macro levels, not predicting the individual. And he specifically talks about the fact that in his model of psychohistory, the individual is very unpredictable. The individual, you can predict broad contours, but individuals, it's hard to get it right. Certain things you can, but as a whole, humans, they tend to zig when the algorithm says they should zag. But as societies, can we look at the broad contours of society, trying to deal with these broad crises? And in particular, it was really fascinating to me, this notion of using mathematics and computing power and massive amounts of observational data to try to understand society, understanding what makes us tick as humans, the narratives that shape our understanding of the world. What are we aware of that's occurring around the world? How is it being framed for us? Essentially, our global dreams and fears. And my own work has focused over the last 22 years on how do we use the massive amounts of data that surround us today, the massive computing platforms that surround us, to essentially use all this material for good. To say, most of our work is how do we sell ads to this person? How do we predict when this person is most amenable to psychological influence to control them, to sell them a new product, to get them to switch brands? But how can we use it for good? How can we answer those grand challenge questions? The ones that don't, don't necessarily have those economic payoffs, but how do we that really help us understand who we are and how do we become better as a society? And I'm going to play this a couple times if I can. In particular, how do we find the subtle among the obvious at scales that no human can understand? And what you're seeing here, actually, this is an animation created several years ago showing the history of the world through the eyes of the English language Wikipedia. So what you're seeing here, so this algorithm essentially went through the English language Wikipedia and pulled out every date and every location in Wikipedia, textual location. So for example, if an article says, in 1870 in London, you'll see a dot in the map. Oops. There we go. So if it says in 1870 in London, you'll see a dot in the map. But then if it says in 1870 in London, this occurred, and at the same time this was occurring in Paris, now you'll see a line drawn between the two to show you the connections across the world. And color-coded. Red is conflict, green is kind of neutral to positive. And of course, you can see the American Civil War, you can see World War I, World War II, you can see all these different things. But what's particularly powerful about this graph is you notice how it's becoming more spaghetti-like. As we get closer to the present, there's more and more and more lines until eventually the whole thing just becomes completely unmanageable. And you'll notice also the parts of the world. So you can see very kind of American, European-centric. And then you can see kind of, this view. And again, because we're looking at English language Wikipedia. But what you're seeing is there's more and more lines being drawn. What that's reflecting is greater contextualization of history. That when I turn to Wikipedia and I look at something about 1830, it's going to say in London in 1830, this happened, period, done. As we get closer to present, what you find is it'll say, this happened, and this happened at the same time that this was occurring, and the same time this is occurring. These are the people involved, and this is why this is happening, and this is what this led to, and this is how this involved this. You're seeing this contextualization of drawing the threads of history together. And this is actually kind of interesting to those with historical backgrounds. It's a little bit inverted. Typically when we talk about things in the past, historians have had that time to really research them in great detail so we understand these threads. So we'll see, I think the Civil War is one of the, I think it has the most books ever written in terms of a historical issue. So you think about all of those narratives about why did this occur? What are all the different threads here? Versus, hey, there's 2 people gathering, at the street corner over here. Now there's 20, now there's 30. I'm not quite sure what's happening here. And so it's kind of interesting, this notion of contextualization of our history. Oops, wrong direction. Today, data offers us incredible new lenses to understand the world. When we think about, could we use computers to try to capture the world around us, to try to see the things that are happening that aren't being covered necessarily in our local media? Today when we talk about mapping society, we typically talk about social media. Billions of isolated tweets coalesce on a map to form an image of society in motion. There are languages tracing national boundaries. There are clusters tracing transportation boundaries. So this was done back in November of 2012, positioning all the geotag tweets. So we can see, we can see roadways, we can see language. The linguistic boundaries tend to trace out national boundaries to a great degree. But what's also interesting here is what we're not seeing. All those holes there, those areas that we're not seeing huge amounts of social activity, and I'll come back to this in a minute. The connections among all of this data allows us to do incredible things. For example, with Twitter, so this is looking at who's retweeting and who's talking to whom. They allow us to trace the communicative and cultural center points of our globalized society, showing us who and what we talk about. But specifically also, far too often we make a map like this of Twitter, and we say, look, this is what society is talking about. And we forget to add that caveat saying, this is what Twitter is showing us about what society is talking about. And oftentimes, we like to say, well, Twitter is society, or Facebook is society. We tend not to think. I mean, this is why, for example, in all three of the last three presidential elections, we've seen, it was the most recent election, I think it was Facebook or Twitter put out that data set that showed Sanders is going to win over Hillary by a landslide. She has zero chance. Because, well, Sanders, people who supported Sanders were very active on social media, far more than her people. And again, this difference between does social media really reflect reality? You had the election before that, that showed almost the entire, I think it was a Facebook map, showed almost the entire country, deep, deep red states, going wholeheartedly to Democrats. Because people that supported the Democratic candidates were more likely to communicate on social media. In fact, it was only just a few years ago in Bangladesh, I believe it was Bangladesh, that the average Twitter user there was between 30 and 35-year-old college-educated male who belonged to one particular political party. And oftentimes, we forget how few people, or how many holes there are in social media. This is a very powerful map. When we talk about whose voice are we not being hearing, some of you may remember in June of 2015, the Houthi rebels in Yemen fired a Scud missile into Saudi Arabia. And so this red box here is Yemen. This is where the missile was aimed at. What you're seeing here is all the locations with Twitter posts around that period. And what you'll notice here is the flight corridor, once it hits Saudi Arabia, is quite well lit up. Yemen, however, not as much, especially where we had a lot of death squads, checkpoints, et cetera, not as well represented on social media. Now, this was particularly important because this led to headlines in the Wash Post and FP and many other outlets saying, this is the dawn of modern conflict. Conflict today will be live tweeted, live Facebook. We're going to see, moment by moment, conflict through the eyes of people on the ground. Because what they were reacting to is what they were seeing, which was, hey, there's a lot of tweets here, a lot of Instagram posts, a lot of other social media posts, but no one was asking that question of, well, whose side are we actually hearing from here? What are all these tweets coming from? So this is a collaboration I did with BBC Monitoring. We used their area experts in country and looked across all of the social platforms. So what you're seeing here is a map of Twitter, but this is reflected in all the other platforms we looked at. Where the Yemeni side was nearly completely absent. We didn't see them. We saw the moment it hit Saudi Arabia, literally as it crosses the border, it lights up like a Christmas tree. And this is very interesting because what you're seeing is that one perspective, that one side of this conflict. And it's important, that as, when social media lights up like a Christmas tree with respect to a conflict, that blinding light doesn't blind us to the darkness in the rest of the room. All those voices that we're not hearing from there. And it's particularly important today to remember that, the quote-unquote public squares of today are commercial entities. They're Facebook, they're Twitter, et cetera. These are run by commercial companies. But, oftentimes we like to demonize these companies as saying, well, look at how they're controlling voices today. But really, these are public squares run not by those companies, but run by advertisers. The voices that are removed are the voices that advertisers tend not to like. We forget it was just 2 years ago that the US Congress wrote this letter to Twitter and said, you need to do more about stopping terrorists from using your platform to recruit, to encourage attacks. We forget that Twitter's general counsel and their CEO wrote that letter back to Congress that said, as reprehensible as these voices are, as much as we may disagree with voices that promote terrorism, that encourage people to launch attacks, we will never censor those voices. That this is a sacrosanct, a very sacred, sacrosanct corporate ideal, that we will never censor those voices. Now, of course, you start seeing, a lot of governments start talking about putting pressure on these, and I want to emphasize that as well. That you saw a lot of governments putting pressure and saying you've got to pull this down, and you saw resistance to that. You saw them being defiant in that. But then all of a sudden you start seeing advertisers standing up, saying, well, I don't like this idea of this post, saying, hey, look at all these people we just killed, isn't this wonderful? And next to it, drink Coca-Cola. well, all of a sudden advertisers started saying, well, we need to be able to control this. So all of a sudden the companies moved so fast. I mean, they tripped over themselves. And of course, we saw the same thing with certain uses of social media to enact revenge. And again, you saw the companies, for example, so I write about censorship is one of the areas I write on. And this response from Facebook of, well, why aren't you doing more? So at the time period, if someone posted a very horrible photograph or image on Facebook, and it was reported, it was taken down, they could just repost that immediately with no consequence. And the question was, well, under US law, certain types of imagery in this country, companies are required to institute certain technological mechanisms to remove that content. Similarly with copyrights, most companies introduce copyright filtering. So the technology exists. The technology exists to remove this imagery automatically, prevent it from being reposted. Why isn't this being implemented? And again, once you saw advertisers step forward and say, this is a real problem, boom, we see the next stage of movement. So it is really interesting when we think about the power of government to regulate and all these calls about, well, we need government to regulate and government to do things. Say, well, actually, the far greater power is advertising, because these public squares are not controlled by governments. They transcend governments. Yes, they exist in different places. Yes, governments can block them, turn off the internet, do all these different things. But at the end of the day, the companies are most responsive. These public squares are most responsive to advertisers. And you think about, yes, social media has all of its issues. But also, the news media isn't much better. We turn on, this is American television national networks, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, all the major national networks. And what you're seeing here from 2009 to 2016, how often each country in the world was mentioned on our national television networks. So that notion of bringing the country together, as we were talking about before, this notion that, these central networks, really bring us together as society and show us a shared view of society, that certainly has been true, but it was a shared view that was very biased. And in fact, Facebook also learned this. You guys may remember a while back the trending topics module, and there was this allegation by Gizmodo that it was very biased against conservative stories. But it turns out that the real story that people missed there was the trending topics module. Facebook had this list of news outlets, 1,000 news outlets. A story had to appear in 3 of those news outlets before it could appear in the trending topics module. What turns out what they used was the ComScore 1000 list, which is basically a list of the 1,000 most popular news outlets in the United States. Again, in the United States. And so actually it turns out if you map those, you get a map that is very similar to this. It turns out if you map Google searches, so all searches by people within the United States last year, how often they search for each country, you get another map that looks almost identical to this. So when we consume media, we get a certain view of the world. When we turn to social media, whether that's us posting ourselves or whether that's Facebook filtering for us, whether we search, those are all lining up. Now, whether that's media driving interest or interest driving media, these are all these wonderful questions that people explore through all kinds of different statistical techniques. But at the very end of the day, there's a lot of the world that we're not hearing from. And even those parts of the world that we are hearing about, so Russia obviously today has become a very hot topic in the media. It tends to be one narrow little lens of Russia, specifically, potential election hacking. We're not hearing all those myriad other stories there. And this becomes very important. And you might say, well, who cares? I mean, why should we care about understanding the data around us? Well, imagine if we could. Look back to the Ebola outbreak. Remember the index case was way back here. And it turns out, actually, there was a fair amount of data at the time period. So, the index case, this wasn't someone dying in isolation. No one had any clue that this occurred, and this is completely absent from any point. That actually was well reflected in available data. Up to the WHO announcement, there was tons of data building here. But again, it wasn't on Twitter, it wasn't on Facebook. I couldn't, run a Twitter data mining algorithm to look at English language tweets and flag that there was an Ebola outbreak here and where it was happening. And that again, so much of the work we do today, we grab the easiest thing. We grab the Twitter fire hose or Facebook's APIs, and we say, what's the easiest data for us to use? We don't say, what are the actual questions that we need to understand as society? What's the data we need to reach for? And of course, this is looking at television news. It really wasn't until the first Americans got it that really all of a sudden it mattered. All of a sudden the entire global press was talking about this. Thousands of people dying. Who cares? Not a story, not interesting. Americans get it. My God, this is huge. And there's a second graph I oftentimes show with this that actually shows the tone of that coverage. And the tone of that coverage, once the first Americans got it, became massively positive. And you might say, well, why would that be? Well, that was because the very first CNN article, the very first article back when the WHO announced this, it was a very upbeat article. It said it was an absolute death sentence. If it reaches American shores, it'll kill us all. Really upbeat, really positive, uplifting stuff. When the first Americans got it, however, what you saw was complete marked change across the entire US media, actually the entire global media system. It said, don't worry, now that Americans have it, modern medicine to the rescue, everything's saved, don't worry, stand by, we're going to solve this instantly. And this becomes very interesting, that notion of, what generates that? What was that mark? Literally, it turns out, as we saw that when these Americans were infected, this wasn't that all of a sudden we started investing billions of dollars and had this major breakthrough within weeks that solved the issue. This was an existing drug that had been around for quite some time. There wasn't the political will. It was, well, who cares? It's from the other end of the world. Who gives a rip? Now all of a sudden Americans have it. Boom. Now we care, and now we're gonna really invest. We're gonna do all these things. So again, kind of thinking about that notion of how does data allow us to see these things, to reflect back on our own empathy and our own understanding about the world around us. And specifically when we think about the past, as Machiavelli, I mean, many have said this, but I love this particular quote: "Whoever wishes to foresee the future must consult the past, for human events ever resemble those of preceding times." And he goes on to, of course, say, because it's humans today and it was humans in the past. And so really, can we use history to see the future? And some of you may have seen, in 2011, I did a paper that got a lot of press attention called Culturomics 2.0. And what this did is it said, if we want to predict future unrest, specifically the Arab Spring, what it showed was by data mining 100 million articles through the lens of emotion, we were actually able to predict the Arab Spring, actually, the countries that went and the countries that didn't go. Bin Laden's location, actually, this is a cute little one. It turns out that the data actually pinpointed a circle, 200-kilometer radius around Abbottabad where he was actually found. This was done before. This was done before he was actually captured. And again, what it's reflecting is not that the machine somehow has this piece, but it reflected, what was very interesting doing the post-mortem of that coverage, is you saw media across the world, especially regional media in the region, really reflecting on all the connections to Abbottabad and really talking, every time they talked about him, referencing all the support base there and referencing all the different pieces that surrounded that. So again, looking at the subtle among the obvious. And in particular, what was so interesting about this was really this notion of that emotion was so powerful. So this was, you think about with that opening quote, by the time the tanks are rolling, down the street, it's really game over. But you think about that, people don't wake up one day and say, you know what, I feel like launching a coup. I feel like committing mass genocide. These things go over long gestation periods, and that becomes abundantly clear in the data. We see these crystal clear in the data. There's this buildup of frustration, of emotion, of conflict. But that's represented in latent forms. By the time you start seeing editorials, condemning a particular group or saying, all of the ills of Germany are these migrants that are coming in, at that point again, it's game over. What you see though is this building up, this fracturing of civil discourse, this pulling apart of our shared understanding of the world and especially our shared priorities. As a colleague of mine used to say, he said, today we focus mostly on data for Superman. We focus on, well, how do we get all this data to the President of the United States so he or she can change the planet, without kind of realizing, we don't need a supercomputer to say there's a problem in Syria right now. We don't need a supercomputer to say there's a problem in Burma right now. But again, politically, are we going to send a large invasion force to Burma and save the Rohingya? Are we going to, intervene? Are we going to send the entire military in? And basically occupy Syria? Probably not. And so to understand that, wouldn't it be better, take, for example, Boko Haram in Nigeria. Instead of telling the President of the United States that there's a problem over here, instead of telling the local military there's a problem, and they already know there's a problem, what if we could take that local village and say, hey, you know what, there's an armed convoy coming to you in about 12 hours, there's going to be a large armed convoy arriving on your doorstep. That's actually where you start having impact. Again, going back to yesterday's, news about the greatest impact is local. That's really where the impact is. You can give people themselves, if you can empower them with the information that they need to make life decisions for themselves. Instead of focusing on government and how do we fix government, how do we allow people themselves to fix society around them? And that Culturomics 2.0 piece, what I focused on there was national stability. Like how do we forecast coups and national collapse? And the reason for that was, at the time period, there was no data set that let me go below that. I wanted protests, but there was no data set that gave me global protests around the world. Sure, there's little, you'll find doctoral dissertation that looks at 6 months of this area. Washington, D.C. has been an area there's been a lot of research, because for a set of years, the Metro Police actually recorded every gathering of more than a few people in a central logbook. And so this has been, obviously heavily used for a lot of research. But there wasn't this data set of, well, could we literally map society going by? What if we could take a report that says, hey, you know what, there's a protest going over here, and actually stick a dot in the map so we can understand that. Because if we want to try to understand what leads to unrest, to crises, we really have to be able to analyze that. So the GDELT project, which is where my work comes from, so really this led to this vision that I call the GDELT project, which is an open data project, which is really about how do we take the world's information and codify what's happening around the world. So a center point of this is global news. So we take print, broadcast, and online, and those are 3 very different mediums, by the way. I know we like to talk about, hey, let's just grab Google News or run a web crawler and grab a bunch of news. But print broadcasts, during the election, you saw 3 polar different views of the electoral realm during the most recent election. If you looked at print versus broadcast versus the online world. Over 100 languages, which I'll come back to in a second about why this is so important. But we grab all this material. The online news also we preserve with the Internet Archive. We oftentimes miss today, how fragile our information is today. That, for example, an entire Twitter thread could just vanish in a heartbeat. In the aftermath of the coup in Turkey, I believe it's almost 60% of the media there has disappeared. In Nigeria, under Goodluck, coverage that criticized the government's response to Boko Haram tend to have a shelf life of about 3 days before it disappeared. So by preserving this material, we ensure that this stuff is permanently archived. Imagery, which I'll come back to, academic literature. So news coverage tends to tell you what's happening. It doesn't tell you why is this happening. What are the undercurrents of this? If we want to affect change, we have to understand, why are conflicts happening? What are the root causes there? Books allow us to look backwards through time. Television allows us to, in particular, look at very high resolution, and human rights as well, looking at very specialized data sets. So you can imagine, if we want to study the world around us, imagine we want to do psychohistory. We want to create this live catalog of human society. Obviously we need a lot of data. So, bringing all of this different data that surrounds us, and each one addresses a different question. What's happening? Why is it happening? Ground truthing it, looking backwards through time, looking at hyper-resolution and field reporting, and being able to look at the visual narratives that surround that. But of course, if we want to understand the world, we have to look at the world through local eyes and local languages. Yes, France has a lot of English language coverage. If I want to see who is going to win the election there, reading the English language coverage in France may or may not have been the best reflection of what was happening there. It is very disturbing. I'm based full-time in Washington. And it is very disturbing to me the number of very high-ranking administration officials, both in the former administration and in the present administration, in the intelligence and other communities, that say, we don't need to look at local sources. A very prominent member of the former administration on the NSC had this beautiful quote where he said, look, I don't need to look at local sources of the Middle East. I can just turn on Twitter and I can see everything happening there. And this reflects English language Twitter, I should add. And this reflects a profound failure to understand what's happening around the world. Being in Washington, D.C., I can tell you the Wash Post doesn't record everything that happens in my local neighborhood. And so even local sources based there, we have to look really, really local. And we have to look in the local languages there. And this is actually a collection, 1 month of GDELT's collection, color-coded by language. And we can see, for example, if we want the continent of Africa, English language coverage isn't enough. If we want India, it's an incredibly vibrant collection of languages. But even, across the world, if we look very closely in Europe, we'd see, yes, in the middle of France, there's French, but there are also many other languages that reflect expats in that area, that reflect other clusters. So again, that ability to look locally. Why is this important? Well, this is about a month of coverage of Yemen. Blue is what we were seeing in international English language coverage of Yemen. Red is what you were seeing in Arabic language press. Across the region. What you're seeing is, yeah, English language coverage covered Yemen, but mostly in major cities, and very, very small, basically a very small band of the overall conflict there. So if you were looking at Yemen through English language coverage, you were seeing almost nothing about what was occurring there. Death squads, checkpoints, all the things that were occurring there, none of that was making it into your coverage. And again, does that, that notion of empathizing, if all I hear about is, well, in a couple big cities, there's some fighting going on, how can I really connect with those people? How can I see the world through their eyes? And so, but what might this look like? If we wanted to actually take the world and actually process it, if we wanted to build this big catalog of global society, how might we actually do that? So in the case of GDAL, we do two things. One, we take a news article and we codify it. So we take an article that says Iraqi leaders criticize Turkey for bombing Kurdish militants. Ironically, this comes from about 20 years ago, this particular example. But nowadays, people are like, oh, is that from last week? So again, showing you how much history repeats itself. But the problem is the machine can't do a whole lot with that sentence. There's nothing I can really do to understand what are the cycles. How do I map the unrest? So taking that and converting that to database entries. So this was actually a map. This is actually a real map made in 2013 as Egypt began falling again. And this map actually became very widely distributed across the NGO and other communities because no one was able to map out everything that was being reported in the media. And again, this is what's being reported. So this becomes very interesting because if you have someone on the ground that's observing something and you say, hey, you know what, this isn't making it to the media, that's very valuable. Or you say, you know what, the media is reporting a big event happening here. I've got someone who's standing right there in the middle of the square. They're not seeing any of this. So the ability to really observe in real time. But again, going back to this notion of physical events are important. But oftentimes, we know that there's a protest occurring over here. What we want to know is how is the world reacting to that? Are they supporting this protest? Are they condemning it? Are they saying, look at those brave people in Venezuela standing up to their government? Or are they saying, you know what, those people, they need to get off the streets, support the government. It's an elect, it's the rightful government, and so just be silent. These are these fascinating, questions of looking not only at what's physically happening, but those latent dimensions behind that. And once we have all this codified, might say, well, why bother codifying this? Why do we need to have machines generate this into taking the textual reporting of the world and making quantitative data? Well, in particular, if we think about how do we take this fire hose? So you imagine collecting all this data, news, et cetera, from around the world, this fire hose of data, translating all these local voices. Why is that useful? Why is that important? Well, once we have this, so this Burundi in December of 2015, and I'll tell you, it was almost 3 days before the first real coverage hit New York Times about Burundi. Because again, who cares about Burundi, right? As America, our national press doesn't really care. Well, guess what? People there do really care. A lot of the world actually cared about this, even though maybe American press didn't. And so what's so fascinating about this is through machines. Once we have this, machines can watch this minute by minute and say, hey, you know what? There's something happening right here. We can send an alert the first time as instability starts heading towards violence. The first images of tanks rolling. So actually, we talk about Turkey, the Turkish coup, as being the social media coup that we're seeing all this in social media. Actually, the very first reports of that coup actually did not come from social media. The very first reports actually were a television crew that was stuck in traffic on the bridge and watched a tank roll by. If you actually go through and make a complete chronology of every available social post, you actually see that mainstream media actually got us the first view of that. And so oftentimes, but again, it's local media, Turkish language television. It's not something here we would be consuming here in the US. But turning to things like the refugee crisis, we can map, so this is actually BBVA, which is a big Spanish bank, did these fascinating maps actually showing refugee inflows and outflows mapped entirely through news media. So this ability to watch a crisis unveil, to be able to look at connections. So every time we hear Syria mentioned, what are the other countries and other cities? What are all the cities that are mentioned alongside of each other? And of course, what you end up with is a map that reflects both the actual transportation corridors of refugees, but also the contextualization of them. And in fact, some of these corridors actually are real transportation corridors that are not reflected in the official UN reports because they're corridors that governments are not very keen to promote and reflect upon. And in particular, what's interesting, if you start zooming in, you actually see how refugees move through Europe, their landing points, and how they flow throughout the continent. We can look backwards through time to see the history, the cycles, we can look backwards at time to map out unrest. So we can see to tease apart decades, to tease apart subtle indicators of unrest. So this is actually protest trends by country over the last 30 years. But we can take these trends and look to the future. and actually uncover cycles of history and say, well, you know what? We can say that a crisis in Ukraine, rewind the clock, let's say we're back on Ukraine. A crisis in Ukraine today matches events in Turkey from 2 decades ago. Things that only become visible at scale. Now again, in today's world, I always love this quote. And again, a picture is worth 1,000 words. It's very interesting also when you try to trace the history of quotes, because ideas have very long periods, but to actually see how an idea has been manifested in words. And this was a famous quote. This actually comes from the advertising world. But today you think about it, we document today's world through imagery. We don't post it as a beautiful day out. We take a photograph of the blue skies. We don't describe protesters marching down the street. We live stream it. And you think about the power that images have to convey. And actually, I love this image in the context of today's conversation about how social media is upending the world, because this was on the centennial of our nation. At that period, there was this new idea of mail by train. That prior to that, if I live in New York and I wanted to send a letter to California, this was a long period. There was no way to send a letter quickly. But all of a sudden, there was this amazing thing called mail by train. The train would come by, it would collect the mail, and you had this wonderful system actually that allowed you to do disbursement at speed. And let's say you lived a few states away, that mail could actually be there by morning. That's incredible. And we forget that at this time period, there was so much concern. What was this going to do? If I'm learning about events this quickly, this is going to profoundly reshape the fabric of our nation, potentially for bad. If a protest breaks out here, other people might join it because they might learn about it in time to join it. My God, this is going to destroy our nation or it's going to save our nation. So we kind of forget, today it's like, what, mail by train? I mean, come on, this is silly. But we forget that throughout history, we've always experienced change. And we've always found ways of addressing that. Society has always incorporated that. But also the emotion that's conveyed by an image. You think about, and of course you have the iconic, there are a number of iconic metaphors from the period in this image. But in particular, you think about the ability of images. Images don't just capture events. Like words, they capture emotion. And if you take, for example, this image is kind of fun. There's a few wrong things of text in here. But what this is taking 600 million pages of books dating back 500 years from over 1,000 libraries worldwide. We pulled out all the images off of all those pages, and they're arranged by year. So in the upper left, we picked one image from each year. So that's an image from a book published in the year 1500, 1501, 1502, 1503, 4, all the way down to 2014. And what's interesting is you look through this, you can see as color begins to show up in illustrations, you can see the topics. You can see kind of this fascinating 500-year view of the world through books. But what's so fascinating is that we zoom in, we can see the elder world's obsession with the danse macabre, the power of death over life. And again, what's so fascinating about this, and this is a very iconic, it's actually called the danse macabre, which is the idea that we all die. That even when it comes to government, that even that great king up there who has absolute authority over all of us, eventually is going to be back to, like the rest of us. Now this is interesting because again, these images, now again, this was published in 1648, but again, it's following that long history, and really talking about, this notion of, death was a common theme. It was something that was so, that was a fixation of society. Fast forward to the 19th century, we have this fascination of science and innovation, much like today. In fact, all these people talking about, oh, technology, social media, my God. Well, guess what, guys? 1800s, industrialization, technology, we're almost an identical time period where everything's being upended. The steam engines replacing all these. My God, all these people, that are driving horse-drawn carriages, they're going to have a job. My God, Uber is going to put taxi drivers out of a job. AI is going to put them out of a job. So we kind of, we oftentimes kind of forget that, all these things that seem like, oh my God, AI is going to put drivers, we got driverless cars. This has never happened in history. We've never had a displacement like this in history. Well, actually, we did. We had, the rise of the automobile. We had the rise of communications. And it is really fascinating. So a couple of years ago, did a big piece kind of tracing the history of the telephone through imagery of the time period. And it's actually really fun. There's an image from, I think, 1920. There's a really fun image. It's actually a picture of a teenager on a phone. and it says, of late, as telephones have spread, teenagers have begun using it. We predict that in the future, children and teenagers will actually use it to communicate about non-business related issues. It won't solely be the domain of a business person. And it's really funny because you think about it, that was completely unprecedented. There was this notion that a technology might be used for non-commerce. My God, this is fascinating. And you actually see this fascinating trajectory as the telephone really shifted from its original intent, which is to connect business people, to greater influence on society. We saw how society was adapting to that, how they were thinking and internalizing about what does that mean. And you saw it across society. I have another slide in another deck that actually shows what telephone booths look like across the world, and how each culture around the world, how they actually reflected local cultural influences across the world, both in architectural design, but in how they were designed to be used, how were they accessed, how would you communicate with others. And so again, to think about that. But you think about, again, going back to this idea of how much imagery we have today and the fact that we document society through imagery. So one of the things that we've done is we've taken about 250 million news photographs over the last 2 years and run them through deep learning algorithms that are cataloging everything that's in that image, the location of the image, OCRing the text of it, looking at all these different dimensions so we can start understanding, how is the world, being portrayed. What if we could, you think about machines historically have been able to do incredible amounts with text. We haven't been able to touch imagery. And so now we do. Now we can actually look at these visual metaphors. We can ask, on the subject of empathy, we can look at what is the percentage of all the domestic, so we're looking only at online imagery for this, but looking, for example, of all the online imagery published over the past year in each country, what percentage of that contains some element of violence, whether that is, and typically in this particular case, that's blood or human morbidity events. Things like a building destroyed doesn't typically get classified as this. So what we're seeing is, for example, here in the United States, when we hear about a terrorist beheading, typically what we see is the ISIS flag, or we see someone standing behind someone kneeling, and that's it. The image ends there. In a lot of areas, you're actually seeing the actual beheading, not pixelated. Refugee crisis. Here we hear about people dying. We hear some people are dying, I guess, on the way over, refugees. In Southern Europe, and areas of Southern Europe, you're actually seeing that imagery day in and day out. But specifically, this is an interesting image. This is what percentage of the imagery features a human face. And why is that important? Because the question is, the imagery we see, does it humanize events by showing us the human impact of them? Or do you see cold imagery of landscape and events? If there's for example, a car crash, are we seeing just a photograph of a car? Or are we seeing photographs of the family crying about the loss of a loved one? We think about this, a child running from a napalm attack became the iconic image that defined the Vietnam War. A 10-year-old's lifeless body on the beach captured for many one of the few images they've seen of the refugee crisis. And you think about that, we're not seeing, on a daily basis these events. And to look at, what parts of the world do they tend to see more of global events through the eyes of the people being affected by that? And what does that do in terms of encouraging empathy? We can also look at the emotions on those faces. And so we can look at, for example, joy or anger or surprise and so on. We see there's actually very different profiles here. And there's some fascinating things that you can do by looking at, and again, what you're also reflecting is different world events that are occurring in each location, but this ability to look globally, and we can actually make maps of this for a particular event. So take, for example, Donald Trump's election. We can make a map like this and see, well, imagery, what was the imagery they chose to portray him? And there's a fascinating map that I oftentimes show, which showed, was just earlier this year, the Philippines was trying to court, Donald Trump, and China was very angry at him at the time. So there's this dual image of him and the Pope superimposed on top of each other. And in the Philippines, which was trying to court him, it had a smiling Donald Trump and the Pope looking haggard and exhausted. And in China, the picture was the Pope beaming and Donald Trump looking haggard and exhausted. It was the exact image down to the actual positioning. They just changed the faces. And I don't know who chose, who copied whom. But it's very interesting. You look at his election, you see the imagery that made the front pages around the world. Was it joyous imagery of thank God, our Savior is here, or was, my God, what's happening over there? And I did a piece for Wash Post last year, or 2 years ago, as Donald Trump was really rising, and looking at the domestic local media of each country, how they were portraying it. What were the issues that they were focusing on? Was it good or was it bad? How was his handling on each of these issues? And what were they thinking about? Well, what would happen if he gets elected? Again, looking globally, looking at all these issues. Now, I love this map. This is global happiness and sadness through the eyes of the media. So, for eons, we've tried to map global happiness and sadness. But what I did here was to say, well, what do we see? Most of us haven't been to, very few in this room probably have visited Syria recently. And so our only understanding of Syria was mediated through what we see through the media, or social media. But here the question was, well, what if we took, so this was 250 million news articles from around the world, 65 languages in this particular case, and basically took, and this is coverage from every country in the world, and said, let's look across all that. Across all that, there were 2.5, I think I have the number here, 2.5 billion mentions of location. So, it says Paris or this or that, and over 300 million photographs, and over 1 trillion emotion scores. So for every news article, we measure about 4,500 emotions out of that article. And these, we work a lot with the psychology community. So, most of the, long story short, when you hear about sentiment analysis, a very popular thing today, tone mining, 96% or 98%, I forget which number, of that comes out of computer science. You have a bunch of people on Amazon Mechanical Turk, and you say, code all these sentences for anxiety. The problem is that, we talk to psychologists, they don't talk about things like anxiety. You have to say, well, how do I precisely define that? Is that sort of a primal anxiety of, there's a monster around the corner? Or is it more of an executive anxiety of, I've got so many, deadlines, or maybe I won the lottery and I don't know how much I won? Psychologists start with that definition and then proceed downward. So you have this incredible richness of emotions that actually have bearing on activity. So, computer scientists say positive, negative. Well, that doesn't usually affect my behavior. Psychologists talk about, for example, goal-seeking behavior. What actually drives us? What motivates us? Is it acquisition of power or wealth or control or doing good for society? And so this particular case, what it did is say, find me every reference across all that coverage to, say, Paris. Every time Paris is mentioned, stick a dot in a map and color code it from bright green, which means on average, all the discussion over that year across the world's media was positive about Paris, or bright red, which is the majority of the coverage is negative. And you see fascinating things here. And you can kind of barely see, well, actually, in 2016, there's more negativity. But the 2015 one, Europe was far more positive, and you saw these thin tendrils of intense negativity coursing their way through Europe. Those are the refugee migration pathways, reflected perfectly in the data. Now, in some cases, they're very interesting. India, in particular, is very interesting. There's been a lot of soul-searching in domestic press about the fact that the Indian press as a whole tends to reflect on the negativity of events rather than the positivity of those events. There's actually been a whole series of editorials lately about, why is this and how do we reform this? So what you're seeing here is a mixture of good and bad, but the US is an interesting one. There's another version of this map that reflects conflict. When you map the US, it looks like an armed civil war. And you might say, well, I don't remember that much activity occurring here. Well, that's because in Great Britain, where most ownership of handguns is fairly restricted. If someone is caught robbing a bank with a handgun, which there is a rarity, it'll say an armed assailant was apprehended by an armed response unit, is now in jail, done. In the U.S., they make it read like a miniature James Bond novel of, the SWAT team, the brave SWAT team came in shooting and they grabbed the guy and they did this and they did this. It's very interesting because yes, we do have a greater militarization here of police forces, but our domestic press really glorifies when we talk about this. And you see these fascinating, in some cases, again, you see things like there was a domestic dispute, I think in Ohio, that the end result was 130 shots fired, 2 SWAT teams involved in a helicopter, and they leveled the house. And so yes, you do have that type of over-response here, but so much of this is how the media is portraying those. It isn't that a bank robber was apprehended. It really goes into glorified detail with this real sort of raw, isn't this awesome cowboy, Western perspective. But that has a huge impact, again, on reflecting of how does society see weaponry? How does it see violence? But we can also do interesting questions. We can ask, we talk about our global society, we talk about civilizations, what brings us, how are we divided? Obviously, there's been infinite famous books written on civilizations. But again, the question I asked then was, well, if we take, let's take the global press. Every time, say, China gets mentioned, what are the other countries that tend to get mentioned alongside of China? Basically, how does the world's media, what countries do they mention alongside of each other? And we end up with some fascinating pieces, something that looks fairly legit to us, but there's all these fascinating details. And if we make a different version of this map for the local press of each country, we see really fascinating things about how each country views the world differently. But as we look globally, we can build, scale no longer limits us. We can look across billions and billions of connections, or in this particular case, we can look at trillions of interactions. In a single year, we can look at all of the totality of the world that's reflected in all this global coverage, the trillions and trillions of connections that are captured in that, and visualize. So this is a small slice that's looking at people, people that appear to have a high influence on society, and we can actually drill in and see really fascinating things about global society of this. Then we can drill all the way in, and we can look at something like CCS, and we see what are all the people, what are the natural clusters, and it turns out each of these clusters that you see actually reflects an aspect of, CCS is a form of clean energy technology, and you see the aspects of how that conversation is naturally clustering, and around the borders of each of these are the reporters, the analysts, those that cover it from that particular angle. So the ability to really instantly understand the connection here. And for those that are kind of technical in the room, the technology that goes behind something like this is quite large. The ability to use massive computing power. We use something called BigQuery for a lot of the work that I do. It's basically a super database platform. But the reason I mention it, even for the non-technical people in the room, is, for example, that cycles of world history, that ability to say what are the natural cycles in history. That was a case, it took one line of code, 2.5 million correlations. So literally just taking a rolling window of the history of every country and comparing it to the history of every other country that in a rolling window, basically brute force, comparing every period of history to every other. One line of code, 2.5 million correlations, 2.5 minutes, and you have your results. And that was something that I had spent years trying to find a way of tractably answering in one line of code. That happiness map I just showed you, 2.5 billion mentions of location, over 1 trillion emotional dimensions brought into that map. One line of code, about 1 minute later, and you have your final result. So we've reached a world now where to ask questions about society, we're no longer limited. We're no longer, we find ourselves limited by data, mostly because most of us lack the imagination to look beyond the data set that's easiest for us to grab, but that doesn't need to be the case. We have the data sets, we have the tools to both ask the questions, how reliable is this data set? If I want to study, say, domestic French views on this issue, I have the data today. That may not be English language Twitter for that, but there are data sets I can reach for today. And there are tools that I can use to understand that global conversation, both to understand the world, but also understand what am I seeing in the world that's different than my neighbor, that's different from someone around the corner. Now again, many of us don't want to expose ourselves to those different viewpoints. We want to remain isolated. We want to wall ourselves off from views that aren't there. And you think about when I was an undergrad all those years ago, one of the things we had to do freshman year is we had to go to the local to our newspaper archive and write about events in a foreign country. And I chose Russia. And at my particular library, it was a month and a half for a newspaper to get from Russia all the way to me, a month and a half. And you think about that. Today, Google News is by no means a perfect reflection of the world society. I mean, it's missing broadcast and print. There's a lot of limitations there. But at least anyone can go to Google News, type, pull up a Russian newspaper, Google Translate. You can get an okay translation of it. So there's nothing really, and certainly there's a lot of English language press there. So certainly, if we want to, we can seek out views from others. We can access that material. It's no longer inaccessible to us, but we choose not to. And the question is, can we use data to really expose people, to help that exposure process? There's a great piece that Google Ideas put together that's a map of the world. You click what country you're in, and it shows you the biggest issues in each other country of the world that are trending in their press that you're not seeing in your own press. So again, this idea that if we want to, the tools exist today for us to see the rest of the world. And I'd like to thank Alphabet, Jigsaw, and Google for their support in this project. And really, how do we understand the world? How do we generate empathy, see the world through others' eyes? And I want to finally end with this image, which really summarizes the dream of my work, which is, and by the way, this is a real photograph. It's a NOAA Science Sphere, big acrylic sphere hung from the ceiling, projectors all the way around. It really looks like this globe just floating in space. It's really it's really beautiful. But I want to, we live in a world in which science fiction dreams like psychohistory are becoming reality. And reimagining the world reimagining society through our data-dense world means we are approaching a world where we can capture crises in their most embryonic stage. Where we can see the world. If we want to, we can see the world through others' eyes. That barrier to see the rest of the world is lowering down. And again, this is all open data. Anyone can utilize this data to understand the world. So thank you so much. And let's utilize data and all of this information to reimagine the world that we live in. Thank you so much.